I hate horror movies. I've never liked them. They've always scared the bejesus out of me. Some people really enjoy that. And I'm sure these are the same people who enjoy doing roller coasters, which I kind of partake in. But horror movies, no. There's something about the jump scares, the gore. There's always something related to religion, and my formerly Southern Baptist heart just can't take it. I don't know. But that didn't stop me from reading horror when I was a kid, right? So I remember when I was in 7th grade reading It by Stephen King, all I think 1,091 pages over the summer, 2 weeks, staying with my dad. My dad was like, "Why are you always reading so much?" I'm like, "Because I just like to read." And I really liked It. I remember the first Stephen King book I read was The Dead Zone. I think a lot in the 80s we were all reading King, and I kept doing so for a long time. But I could never really get into horror films, even as much as I liked It and have this like attachment to it because it was like one of these first books big books I ever read. I still can't go back and watch the film. It scares the shit out of me. So naturally today, our two guests, when I said, "Hey, let's do a movie for the podcast," said, "Absolutely, let's do Carrie." Shit. I got to go back and watch this damn thing. Awesome. Well, we're going to do Carrie today because it's really important to talk about. It's one of those touch point films, these things from the late 70s. I think all of us kind of remember this film. It's kind of permanently ingrained in our minds. We think about horror. We think about high school films. This is one of those movies, right? I think we could all imagine Sissy Spacek right there at the scene where she gets the blood dropped on her head, the bucket dropped on her head, and so forth. Even if you haven't seen the film, you know the scene, right? It's kind of one of these iconic film scenes in American history, probably one of the biggest 100 or 200 film scenes in American history, certainly. So we're going to dive into what Carrie has to say today, too. We're going all the way back to high school. We're going to talk about Carrie. We're actually going to talk about the remake as well as the influence of Carrie on American film history. And I've got two amazing co-hosts with me today, two HATM regulars, people who regularly run the show whenever I need to step aside. So I'm really excited to be able to bring them on board. And I'm talking, of course, today about Rachel Gunter and Nicole Donawho. Nicole is a professor of history at a community college in North Texas. She specializes actually in dual credit and history pedagogy, which I think is actually fascinating. Her main non-academic interests are actually Star Trek, tattoo, and dogs, which are actually, I think, main academic non-interest are interest for most anybody. And our other guest, Rachel Michelle Gunter, received her Ph.D. in history from Texas A&M University in 2017. And is also a professor of history at a community college in North Texas. And she works on women's suffrage movement and its effect on the voting rights of other groups, including immigrants, servicemen, World War I veterans, Mexican Americans, and African Americans. And she's currently working on a book manuscript, Suffragists, Soldiers, and Immigrants, Drastic Changes to Voting Rights in the Progressive Era. So we're going to jump in today. We're going to talk about Carrie. We're going to have a blast with this. I hope you guys dig it. If you're into horror movies, I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. We're going to see where it goes. And of course, like every other one of these, this goes all over the place. So I hope you dig it. So sit back. It's time for prom because Carrie is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Rachel Gunter, Nicole Donawho. How are you guys?
Great.
Doing good.
So Rachel is now discovering that this is actually not a sign language episode of the Historians of the Movies podcast.
Rachel has an asthma cough, so I'll try to mute when I cough and come back on when I'm good.
Does an asthma cough say that you are also possessed by the devil?
If you're asking Carrie's mom, we're all possessed by the devil, so sure.
Outstanding. That's good. I'm looking forward to getting in a fight with Carrie's mom at some point in time. So our longtime HATM people who've been with us on Sunday nights know you guys. But for people coming to the podcast, talk to me a little bit about like who you are and like what you do. Like, why are you a historian? What kind of history do you do?
Nicole, you want to jump in first?
I guess I can. So I am a professor. I specialize in dual credit. And so I teach up here in North Texas at a community college. And so, oh, there goes my dog. I also foster dogs. And so all of our HATM folks probably see my dogs pretty frequently on our feed or on Rachel's feed, because sometimes she's over at my house. And so, yeah, that's what I do. And I teach the U.S. surveys. And so I really look at the entire scope of U.S. history. And so I am currently deep diving into teaching a series for an outside thing on American horror stories. And so in the fall, I'm going to be teaching a class on ghost tourism, which I'm very excited about for that series.
Oh, very nice.
Yeah.
It's going to be a good series. So I'm Rachel Gunter. I have a Ph.D. in American history. My specialty is citizenship, voting rights, and women's suffrage in the teens and 20s. And I do a lot of stuff with that, working on a manuscript there. I'm doing a great courses thing that we'll be filming in December. It'll come out next year on kind of overlooked moments in U.S. history. And some of that will come from a lot of the voting rights and citizenship work that I do. I'm also a professor at a community college, the same one that Nicole works at. We kind of bond over being some of the small cohort of female professors there, and we're probably younger than the average history prof there by a good 30 years. So we kind of bond together in that. So we both teach a lot. Our standard load's a 5.5, and we're usually teaching overloads and stuff. So we go back and forth with different teaching activities and how we want to present things in the classroom. And HATM is great at that because we get to talk with other professors, but also the public about things that maybe we've done deep dives on and they're less familiar with. And it helps us come up with ways to explain it to our students in ways that are easier for them to get, and gives us more of those pop culture references as well. Because I watch a ton of movies with HATM that I would never watch on my own, both classic stuff and new stuff.
I've known you guys on Twitter for years now, and this is actually our first conversation, like
right?
Actual talk time. So, and you're absolutely right. Like, there are tons of movies that HATM has required me to watch because people was like, hey, can we watch this? Or I try to like throw this out there, things I would never watch, including fucking Carrie. This movie, which was like, I was like, hey guys, let's watch a movie together. Let's talk about a movie. Anything you want. And you're like, here, let's do a horror film, Jason. But before we get into that, let's ask the most important question of the day. Coke or Pepsi?
Coke.
Root beer.
Rachel, that's
Root
gross.
Beer. Any day of the week. I don't drink Coke. I don't drink Pepsi.
Which root beer?
Just a good one with the creamed bourbon in it.
See, I'm an IBC guy.
No, you have to have a favorite. If you're going to go root beer, you have to have a preference.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, like
But I'm not a soda
A&W or
person.
bust.
You know, A&W is really good. Barks is, I think, kind of solid.
Barks is solid, yeah.
Mug, which is Pepsi's root beer, is just awful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Everything that Pepsi makes is terrible. Pepsi is really the Texas barbecue of soda.
Oh, hang on now.
Jason, you're gonna find this so sad. I can't eat most barbecue.
Why is that?
Because I have migraines, and so I can't have any smoked meat. So like I can't eat barbecue.
That's the saddest thing.
We have accidentally poisoned her before.
Yeah.
No kidding. That's awful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, before we go on, like, I know this is not a Star Trek related episode, but I gotta ask, Nicole, your gigantic Star Trek episode, before we get into this, favorite captain, who you got?
Oh, Picard by far. I think like no doubt about that. I think Cisco would be next. But I think some of that has to do with like the fact that DS9 I think has the best character development, just like by far in all of the series. So I really like his character development, but like I was a TNG, like TNG was my first. And so like you always love your first, right?
You do. I respect your choices. I had to watch one of the Star Trek films this morning. I was telling you, and it was awful, but I'm going to talk about that in the podcast tonight. Look, they're not all good. Not all Star Wars movies are good.
No, not all Star Trek is good. Like, I would solidly agree with that.
I think the idea of Star Trek is actually better than Star Trek itself. Much like I think in a lot of ways, like the idea of Star Wars is probably better than Star Wars is, at least now. Idea of James Bond is actually kind of better than what we've seen on screen. It's kind of hokey and whatever. But the idea of Carrie, what do we think about this movie? Like, why did you say, I asked you guys, like, let's pick out a movie, and you were both like, let's do Carrie. And I'm like, great. Awesome. Why did you make me watch a horror film?
So when I was really starting to work on my manuscript, I was reading a bunch of stuff on writing. And Stephen King has a very famous book called On Writing, where he does his process. And I've read a couple of Stephen King books, but I wasn't a huge, it's not my thing. I haven't read, 30 of them. And the story of how he wrote Carrie, I thought was really interesting.
This is his first book, right?
Yeah, this is the one that actually finally made him money. He talks about his kid had an ear infection. He didn't know how he was going to get the pink stuff, right? The antibiotic. And then he sold this book and they were able to buy the medicine. And it ended up being they were able to buy the house and he was set for life basically off of the movie rights off this book. But he kind of sketches out this story and he throws it in the trash. He's like, I don't know teen girls. I can't really write this. And his wife picks it up and is like, you have to write the story. And she's like, I know teen girls. I'll help. And that's the story of she saves his first big break. And so I love that kind of marriage partnership between the two of them. I love him knowing that he doesn't get her psychology, that he's not real sure about this whole thing with teen girls. And if you read the book, it is very 1970s. Every female character is introduced by their breasts. And then as they do anything, you get to learn what their breasts are doing.
Yes, that is correct. I shall not.
Yes, I did notice that when I was.
No, don't reveal. Yes. Damn, son of a. Yeah, go on.
The gym teacher is unbreasted, and yet her whistle hangs between her breasts, and everyone sits down with their upturned breast, and it's just constant, which does feed into the original movie, right? It's very male gazy, which is one reason I like the remake so much better. But the actual story behind how he wrote Carrie, I think, is really fascinating and really sweet for such a kind of revenge, vengeance film.
Yeah, I liked it for totally different reasons.
So you're just negating everything Rachel had to say. You're like, all that was fine, but actually no.
Yeah, Rachel's like, oh my gosh, I loved this from an author's perspective. And I loved it because it was a sweet story with his wife. I like this book. I have always loved Carrie because this is for me, a great example of every woman's desired female rage. There are so many days when I'm like, I hate all of you and I'm going to burn this place down. And so many days I am anarchy. I just want to burn it all down. And so by the end of the movie, I'm like, yeah, Carrie. I'm just okay, maybe don't murder everybody. That seems a bit much, but I'm just yes, burn the whole town down. And so,
if it helps any, as we rewatched the remake last night, me and SNEH, Chris, and he was giggling the entire time that she was murdering everybody.
Good times. Yeah, it's that's some life choices.
You deal with so much trauma, and at some point, you either go to therapy or you lose it. And she didn't have access to proper therapy, so I feel that was the obvious outcome for her. So
you think about this movie a lot is in terms of what it is. You obviously you've got the iconic shots of Sissy Spacek and the blood coming down and things like that, and you think this is one of the first King horror film. And of course, she's had so much success with a lot of them. We could talk about our favorite King books in a little while if you like, if there are ones that you do want to revisit or something like that. But it's also, it's really, it takes these ideas of ostracism and the idea of not fitting into, and really, it does have that kind of revenge fantasy. Because I don't know about you guys, were you sitting in on a certain social circle in high school? Was there a place where you were at? I'm not saying necessarily the bloodlust, right? But
I was a choir nerd. I lettered in varsity choir. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so did I.
Choir?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
People come up to me all the time. They're like, "Where'd you play ball, man? What position you play?" I'm like, trombone. I was band geek all the way. No girlfriend, no hope, no nothing like that. It was just awkward.
No hope.
Oh god, not in West. This is a smart ass kid in Western Kentucky, So yeah, it's did not fit in at all. Now I didn't try to kill everybody at the dance, only because no one would invite me to the dance. So so there was that.
I will say, I think Rachel might get this just because I know Rachel so well. But I was in this social circle of sort of the town that I grew up in and went to school in. I was in this social circle of like sort of the top 10%, like academically, which back when I was in high school was like not a particularly difficult achievement. Like it was not like teens today that are under this intensive pressure. I like took a couple AP classes, took some dual credit classes, and they were like, great, you're good. And so I was in this like cohort of like moderately smart students, but then we all went to church together. And so it was very much like the town that I went to was one of those like evangelical, like footloose towns. And so we were all in that very like purity culture, bless your heart kind of town. And that was like the group that I was in. We were not like cliquish in the sense of like, ooh, your clothes are weird, but it was like, oh my gosh, sweetie, your dress is a little short. And so it was like that kind of cliquish, or like, oh my gosh, you're not coming to Bible study this week? Like, are you sick?
The word gets out very quickly.
Yes, it was one of those kind of towns. And so like I like upgraded my social status a little bit when I started dating the son of the largest church's like deacon, like the deacon's kid.
The only one that could save you was the son of a preacher man?
Yes. Before that, I had been dating the captain of the wrestling team, and I was less cool at that point than when I was dating the son of a deacon at the church.
I'm sorry, the song is in my head right now. Like, I'm gonna have to get Fletcher to like lay in the tracks for that. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like that was very much our town's like clique-ishness.
My high school was nothing like that. So I am the daughter of a preacher man. So that kind of small Southern Baptist church dropped that in the middle of Houston and then put me in a high school with, I mean, we had more than 1,000 people just in my class when we started freshman year. I think we graduated with only like 700 though. So it was a massive school, right? Big city, but small, little 90-person Baptist church that I grew up in at the same time.
I'm dying to read like a paper now on like the sexuality of preacher men.
Preacher men's kids.
Yeah, I went to school with a bunch of Southern Baptist guys, and those guys, half of them went off to go off to be pastors, and I was part of the Southern Baptist Student Union at Murray State University. Those guys were wild.
PKs are always wild, right? Pastors' kids.
Oh my gosh, it was nuts. So now that we've alienated half of our viewers,
well, we are some, so. Yeah.
That's fair.
I mean, my dad ran a prison ministry, like
for real.
Yeah, for real. Like you'd have to be careful when I was talking to him when he was alive. When I would talk to him, and be like, "Hey, are you going to prison this Saturday?" Like, yeah. And then you realize like people at the Starbucks think your dad's going to prison for good.
Right.
You get lots of casserole dishes that way, though, if you scare the church ladies.
Yeah, I wonder. In Minnesota, they actually call that hot dish, or if you've ever been up there, it's like this flavorless thing with tater tots. But that's a whole other podcast.
They make it with hash browns down here, but yeah.
Yeah. Let's talk about this movie. What the hell is Carrie trying to say? Like, what are the themes of this movie? Like, you talk about what King laid into this. I think that's like one of the geniuses. It's like he really had to get outside his own comfort zone to like try to get into the mind of somebody else, right? And write the story from the perspective really of a young ostracized woman. What is this movie trying to tell us? Like in the 1970s.
One of the things that I sort of picked up on is this, like we see a lot of, especially once you get into like the 90s, right? You have this sort of theme of the like ugly duckling kind of movie, where you have like the girl that doesn't fit in, and then she takes off her glasses and lets down her hair, and she's suddenly pretty.
And she's all that.
Yeah, she's all that. She's very cool. But like, I think that this is like a different version of that, where like it's not that she's not pretty, because like I think even in the book she's not considered like ugly in any way. She's just sort of simple.
The way he puts it is kind of grossly overweight and acne on her face and body.
Oh, is it in the book? I thought that it was that she was just sort of simpler. But in the movie, at least, right? Since we're talking about the movie, in the movie, she is just
she's
sort
always
of like,
pretty.
Yeah, she's just sort of like simple, right? And her clothing and her hair and that sort of stuff. And so it's really more of this like social ugly duckling that like she doesn't quite understand how to like fit in. And I think that that's really one of the themes that you sort of see, is that like all of these other people in the school seem to have a very, very obvious place that they fit in, maybe with the exception of Sue, who is like, well, like I fit into this group, but she's trying to do something different. And so you have this sort of like transformation of those two in this film. Yeah. And so like, unlike other films where you sort of have just the one sort of like ugly duckling that does this sort of transformation, you have this sort of flip of the two in this film, which I sort of saw kind of throughout. And her mom does not change at all. She's just crazy the whole time.
Well, she changes from a state of being alive to a state of not being alive.
That is true. Good picking up on that.
But a lot of people undergo that change in the film.
Lots of them do. And even more in the book. Like, she takes out the whole town in the book. Mm-hmm. It's not just the high school and her mom.
Right.
Yeah.
But so getting to this, if this is kind of this weird thing, because we think about like your traditional high school films, right? Which first thing comes to mind, it's gonna be like Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, maybe for people from a little bit later generation, 10 Things I Hate About You or whatever, right? Those are all kind of like fun, lighthearted high school films. But then you've got like this, and maybe does this movie give us like Heathers later on? I mean, this is a kind of different kind of high school film. Like, do we think about it in terms of the high school genre? Like, what does this tell us about high school itself?
I think the aspect of bullying is very much in a high school setting, because for high school kids, like, that's a very different thing to have to go every day and be around all these people who don't like you. And in the book, she's constantly worried she's going to be the butt of the joke. She's constantly worried that she doesn't understand what they're saying, or that she's missed something, or that they're picking on her and she just doesn't get it. Which I do think there's a lot of stuff online of like neurodivergent people identifying with her a little bit. And I think that's the connection, like worrying that neurotypical people have made them the butt of the joke and they don't get it, or they're not quite sure the unspoken communication going on. So I think that kind of intensity of bullying for high school kids, where you have to go every day, right? You can't get away from it. And it does feel like your whole world, and time moves so slowly when you're a teenager. Like, it feels like it'll be forever that you're in high school. So I think the bullying part and it being in the high school really kind of places it in that high school mentality.
Yeah, and I think that like when you compare this even to other high school horror films, like the Scream series, for example, which obviously comes much later, like you have this film that like in the Scream series, like you have the very obvious tropes, right? Of like, if you're having sex, you're going to die, right? So it's very like Mean Girls. If you'll have sex and you'll get pregnant and then you'll die. And so you have the very obvious tropes of like either the black kid or the blonde chick dies first. If you're having sex, you die. You seem to be running a million miles an hour away from them and they're walking, and you're still going to end up dead somehow. And so you have these kinds of tropes here that don't seem to match up with Carrie, except for maybe the fact that like they're driving a car and she still kills them. And so she's just like walking up and then they're dead. And so you have these kinds of things that don't quite match up, because Scream is obviously, that series is meant to be a little bit funny. Like Carrie is very obviously not. It's meant to show us sort of these ideas of revenge in a way that Scream does too, but it tackles them from very different perspectives. That Scream is almost making fun of these high school cliques and these sort of social groupings
and the sin trope and all that.
Yes, and that sort of stuff. And Carrie is really just trying to expose these things in sort of a raw sense for what they are. Because I think once we see Carrie and we get through that sort of stuff, and you have some of these other horror films that, and books and other things that sort of play on that, by the time you get to like the 90s and early 2000s, people sort of laugh about them because so many people have experienced it and are able to sort of laugh at it and go to therapy.
And I hadn't thought about this until you said that, but you said, in the trope, you have sex, you get pregnant, or you die. But that's pretty close to Sue. She has sex, she gets pregnant, her boyfriend dies.
Yeah.
Right? That's her whole line. But yeah, the bullying thing really comes through. And then Columbine happens and it changes how we see this whole book, right? The remakes are different post-Columbine than the OG is because of Columbine and the school shooting phenomenon. And King has been very open that he compares her to the Columbine killers after that happens, right? That it changes how he sees her.
Well, let's talk about Columbine then, because we're recording this. We're recording this, 3 days after yet another school shooting in Nashville. Was on a Monday. What are the allusions here? Can you draw us out a little bit more between, say, Carrie and how does Carrie influence maybe Columbine, or how does Columbine change how we look at Carrie?
So Carrie is originally a revenge fantasy of a bullied kid. And the false history we initially get after Columbine is that they were bullied kids who acted out their revenge fantasy. And then the more we learn about Columbine, the more we learn that wasn't true, that those kids were bullies from the get-go, that they were not necessarily in that group that was always picked on, that they were known for being cruel to other kids from the get-go. And it changes how we see the Columbine story. But if you buy that earlier false narrative of them as the kids who were picked on to the point that they killed their classmates, it lines up with Carrie. And I think if you look at the remake, there's kind of a very careful change to some of the high school students to make them seem almost a little more cruel. And also to point out that Carrie's not just the bully, she's cruel from the get-go. So you have to kind of change both the other high school students and Carrie a little bit to give yourself some distance from that false Columbine narrative that is still so strong from people who maybe saw the original press coverage and never, read up on some of the other stuff that came out after the full investigations.
I think one of the things that's interesting that really reflects where we were even in the sort of immediate post-Columbine period is that there's not really much of a change in the way that Carrie's mother is portrayed. Like when we talk about school shooters and when we talk about this sort of stuff, there is still in a large portion of the population the initial reaction to, obviously there's a lot of blame put on the students and not students, but the shooters, but also their parents, especially when they're minors. And so, well, where were their parents? Where did they get these weapons? Why didn't their parents know? That sort of thing. And I think a lot of people have started to understand that there are a lot of things, especially a lot of parents have started to understand and say, well, like, there are some things, like, especially when you have a teenager that like, they don't talk to you, you don't know. Like it's incredibly difficult to keep up with a teen every day of the year and every second of every day. And so they simply didn't know. And they can be one way at home and another way at school and another way with their friends. And you simply don't know. And so there's a lot of that, but I think especially right after Columbine and in the years right after, we were still very much, not me, because I was like 7. We as a nation were very much still in the mode of where were the parents? And so you don't really see a shift in the way that her mother is portrayed, that it's still very much, well, the mother caused this because the mother was crazy. And the mother didn't stop her and things like that. And the mother tried to stop her, but still it's the root of the mom's trauma passed on to her that causes her to do this, which I think is really interesting. And Rachel and I watched a new remake of this that has Zac Efron in it, and that one
it's a reinterpretation.
Yeah, it's like a reinterpretation.
Right? So Carrie
of it
is now Charlie. She's much younger.
Yeah.
What is
Both
this?
of her parents have psychic issues.
Look, we just discovered this. Yeah, we just discovered this 2 days ago.
Yeah, I saw. Yeah, okay.
It's really good.
Yes, but like both her parents are alive initially, and they're very loving and very caring, and so it's like very obviously this like different sort of thing for like, what was it, 2022 when that one came out?
Yeah, it was very recent.
Yeah, and so it was very obviously a very different interpretation of this.
So much so that they changed her name.
Well, no. Firestarters are a remake of the original with Drew Barrymore from their early 80s.
I'm not familiar with that one. The version we watched said it's based on Carrie.
Really?
Yeah.
No kidding. Because King,
that it's from the famous King.
Yeah.
So maybe it's the stories are so similar it played that way, or maybe we're just wrong and it actually is this other story.
The thing that interests me here that say we have in current on, of course, this film was remade just recently with Chloe Grace Moretz in the title.
So good.
Right. You were
so
saying,
good.
I want to hear your takes on this. And I think I know exactly where you might be going to this, because you said you actually, and this might sound like heresy, you say you prefer the remake to the original.
I far prefer the remake to the original.
Why?
For several reasons. For one, you actually get some drawn out scenes that I think play a lot better. So like, I want to see the crappy guy who put the pig's blood really get killed. You don't get that in the original, right? You get him turning a steering wheel of car crashes. Like you get a nice drawn out revenge murder scene of him and
Wow.
the terrible woman in the remake.
Okay.
Rachel wants to
You
see the
lose?
murder.
I'm a little afraid of reviewer number 2, like on your manuscript right now. I'm like, you know what? I didn't want to change that point in that argument, and I like that chapter the length that it was. But okay, we'll deal with this on my own. But go on.
You get more on the mom's psychology, and you kind of understand Carrie's psychology a little more from the birthing scene. You actually get the stones coming down, which you get a lot more in the book. And so you get a little more into her powers and does her mom have powers or not? Like, we don't really know in that movie. And we mentioned before that kind of the male gazy stuff that ends up in the first movie is much more limited in the remake. Like, it is a product of its time. And I think the burnout scene where the gym teacher is burning out the girls who've picked on Carrie and the famous kind of period shower scene is the worst of that for me, because they start at kind of the top and they're slowly panning down as the girls do each activity. And the activity they have the girls doing is very purposeful. So by the time they're doing squats, all you can see is the gym teacher's butt and the girls' legs coming in and out of frame. And then you drop down to gym teacher's ankles and they're doing sit-ups, but their crotch is facing the camera. And like, it's just very like disembodied female body parts kind of thing. It's very male gazy and creeps me out a little bit. So I like the newer version for that as well. But yeah, just the pacing is I think is better in the new one. Like, I think it is definitely more of a popcorn watch, but you also get some of the psychology that I think is missed a little bit in the first one. The first one's great, right? For its time period, it's awesome, but it is a product of its time. And that male gaze thing that is so prevalent in it is a little cringe to me.
Nicole, do you like this as much as the original?
I think I do. I tend to agree with Rachel's assessment quite a bit. I can't remember. Is that the one that we watched together? We watched one of them together.
We watched the remake together.
Okay, that's what
and
I thought.
then the deleted scene for the remake, I think they should have left in. That is the best ending.
Yeah.
So, and if you haven't seen it, if you've watched the remake and you just saw the ending where, you know, Sue walks to the headstone and it cracks and it's over, you haven't seen the real ending. That's the theatrical ending.
What's the real ending?
Go on YouTube.
No, tell us
the real
now.
ending. So if you watch the original movie, it ends with Sue in this kind of nightmare that Carrie has come up through the grave and has grabbed her arm. And then you realize Sue is in bed and her mother's trying to wake her up out of this kind of PTSD nightmare. In the remake version, the ending that they should have used and didn't, but they didn't ask me, Sue is having the dream. She's pregnant in both the book and in the remake, right? They don't do that in the original movie. So she's pregnant and she's dreaming, which you don't know she's dreaming, but she's dreaming of giving birth and something's going wrong. And instead of Carrie's bloody arm coming up out of the grave to grab her, Carrie's hand comes up out of her. She is giving birth to Carrie, which suggests that she is actually pregnant with Carrie's reincarnation. And then she wakes up screaming. She is still pregnant and her mother is holding her, trying to wake her up out of this nightmare. So she's like 7 months pregnant at this point. And the suggestion is that she is pregnant, not just with her dead boyfriend's baby, but possibly the reincarnation of Carrie.
That's some fucked up shit.
Right?
It's
so good. And it is like
gosh.
scene for scene, like an homage to the original ending, which I, you know, as a historian, I always think that's really cool, where they kind of set up like we're paying tribute to what came before, but we're changing it up a little bit.
I appreciated it because like I did not get that when I read the book. Like in the book, I don't know if I was just reading too fast, but like I did not get that she was pregnant at all in the book.
Yeah, it's like 2 sentences and it's like she's 2 weeks late and she's never been a day late before.
Yeah.
Right.
What about the role of social media in like the
remake?
Yeah.
It works really well, right? Because the girls are recording the shower scene and then they're showing it to each other, but they don't post it online yet. And then they kind of edit it a little bit. And they're worried when they post it about who's in it, who can be seen, what might be the consequences of that. And it does have consequences, right? That's the whole reason. Who's the evil girl?
I was literally just trying to think of her name and now I can't think of it.
That's the whole reason evil girl can't go to prom. Chris.
Yeah.
That's the reason Chris
Chris
can't go to prom.
Yeah.
See, my brain doesn't want to think of Chris's as being evil since I'm married to one. So that's the name slip.
I was once married to a Chris. So, you know,
I was once engaged to a Chris.
Wow. This is heady
So
stuff.
married, engaged, and divorced to a Chris. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I found interesting from so I'm also like a certified K-12 teacher, right? And so I have taught just like regular high school before. And one of the things that I find really interesting about the social media aspect of it, just from like a practical teaching legal perspective, is that like when we have had instances of things similar to that happen in schools, like if you
the shower scene, like
the shower scene, like if you distribute something like that, even as a teenager, that is child pornography. Like you're not going to prom, it's you're going to prison. And so I'm like, I don't understand. Like, was that not like, you would think that that would still be like a very more serious thing back then, but it seems to not have been.
Although in the remake, they're very careful. And again, this is the male gaze thing, right? In the original, there's just naked women walking around in some places for no reason in the locker room, just naked.
Yeah.
And in the remake, there's very carefully placed towels and you never quite see all of that. So maybe that played into it some.
There's a lot of steam for a public school bathroom. Like
True that.
Our showers were never that hot. Like, I want to know what their budget for warm water is. Like, we never got showers that warm.
But the social media video ups the ante in the like horror moment where the blood comes down because she gets splattered with the pig's blood, but then the video starts playing, right, with the sound. And so there's more of a connection. Whereas in the original, they're just yelling, right? Blood for a pig, pig's blood for a pig kind of thing.
Well, it's like, I think it's one of the great strengths, they had the opportunity in the remake to talk about this, and I'm glad that they did because, I also taught for 3 years in high school here in Florida. And especially at the latter school that I spoke to, a lot of my students really would talk a lot about the anxiety of social media in their own lives, about this need to perform all on social media, whether it was Snapchat or Instagram or TikTok or any number of those things, because they had to be seen a certain way via social media, not just on, so this like social media continues like the classroom experience beyond the doors of the high school, right? And so you're always under the gaze of your peer groups, maybe of your rival groups or whatever in social media. And the students would often reflect to me in very real terms, like how stressful it was to always be under the gaze. And I have to imagine that it also gets used for bullying as well.
Oh, yeah.
Creating social hierarchies within these schools.
Well, and you think like in my day, which I'm not that much older than these kids, but even if you weren't super popular at school, you came home and like maybe there were some kids on your street, but you didn't have to talk to those kids for the rest of the day. Whereas now you're logging into your like online classroom stuff to do classroom work and you're still discussing with them after hours and you're on social media and you're seeing what they're saying, what they're posting, where they're hanging out without you. It's a little more relentless. And I think even for adults, it's hard to remember that you don't see people's behind the scenes footage on social media, right? You're seeing their curated, right? This is the best selfie I took this morning. This is how amazing my meal looks. This is, all that stuff. And for kids, it's really hard to kind of see through that and be like, oh, well, she has a filter on that. And she took 15 of those photos. And if you look closely, there's the selfie stick in the side, right? Like this is all curated. But it's made to look like this is just how I woke up in the morning. And, this is what you're supposed to look like and how you're supposed to be and how you're supposed to feel.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I'm wondering about the legacy of Carrie. Like what's going back to like the original film. Both of you guys are big horror fans. What does this movie inspire, I guess, film-wise, cinematically, moving forward?
I think there's a Kill Bill throw in there. I think the bride covered in blood on that revenge thing, that is a Carrie moment, man. And listening to Tarantino, he talks about like, you need something really bad because the whole thing's a vengeance film. So we need something bad enough that the audience forgives her for that. I think where Carrie loses it is in the kind of school shooting moment. We don't forgive her despite all of the bad. But that very kind of that image of her in the fancy dress, covered in blood, set on vengeance, that is very like Kill Bill and Carrie are right there for me.
Yeah, I think it really sets up the sort of, not necessarily like go-to structure, but like a solid structure for a vengeance film that you sort of see in other things, like especially against younger people, right? That it's not that you can't see younger people as infallible, that they're so young that you can't target them almost, that like the vindictiveness of teens especially is something that is like worthy of revenge, especially from their own group. That like a lot of people, I think, resonate with this idea of like wishing that they had been able to be vengeful against the people that they went to high school with. And so I think that a lot of these films are not necessarily like geared towards obviously the audiences of the people that are like the age in them. Like it's not for high school audiences. It's for like us. It's for people who are like in their like, I don't know, 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever, and look back on it. And they're like, yes, like if only I feel resonant with that for whatever person that was on the football team or whoever, like, right. And I think you sort of find that generationally in these kinds of films, like, and Carrie sort of sets the stage for that. I think in a way that today we would look back on and be like, that's a bit much. But it sort of sets this standard for that you can build up to this big thing. And you can have sort of like small snippets along the way and sort of the trauma that builds into this. Like, I think that there's a lot to like unpack in the religious trauma in Carrie, that I think a lot of people, especially who were kids and teens in the like 80s, 90s, early 2000s would really resonate with. And so I think that a lot of people are drawn.
The deconstructionist side of TikTok would definitely have a field day with Carrie's mom.
Yes. And so like, I think that even if it's not as extreme as that, like as extreme as her mom, like there's a lot of stuff that people would be like I was almost not allowed to go to the prom. I couldn't go to any high school dances or middle school dances or anything like that. Like my mom wouldn't let me do that. I was never really allowed to wear makeup, like all of that sort of stuff. And so and like my mom was obviously not as crazy as Carrie's mom. Like we didn't have a prayer closet. But like it doesn't take that much to have these very strict beliefs that then have an impact on who you end up being in high school and how popular you're perceived to be, and the sort of limitations there for your social circles that define who you are. And so I think that a lot of people in sort of my generation, very much like millennials in particular, like really resonate with that, given how we were raised in that time period.
I got two things to say about that. First of all, I did go to prom. My girlfriend dumped me after prom. So Melissa, if you're out there, you broke my heart. And then
shout out Melissa.
He's going to rebuild it on the Appalachian Trail, though.
There you go.
But let's talk about this role of religion. What is King talking about? How does King view religion through Carrie?
So the interesting thing to me with Carrie's mom, she's always quoting scripture, but you realize, especially if you know scripture, that she's not actually quoting scripture. She's warped it, and she's got her own version of it that she thinks is real. Are you telling me
people will like take scripture and make it their own? Okay.
There you go. Right. So there's a very kind of blatant thread of like, yeah, they keep saying this is about religion. They keep saying this is about sin, but it is her own thing. Like, so when they go to church, they believe that the Baptists are now antichrists. And so the church is mom preaching to Carrie the congregation 3 days a week, right? That's church. So she's very much twisting religion for her own means and in a very kind of warped, psychologically harmful way, both for herself and Carrie. And so it's very blatant that he's talking about people who use religion for other purposes. Like this isn't really about religion and God and all of that. There's a lot of shame built about sex, right? She believes that Carrie wouldn't have started her period if she hadn't been having impure thoughts. She believes that Carrie's born of sin because she had sex to conceive Carrie. Now, how she thinks other kids come about, we never know. But any sex, even in marriage, she considers to be sinful. And so it's this very warped thing, but it's an extreme view of kind of the purity culture stuff that was certainly already around back then and would get worse into the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. And I think that it's really interesting that you have all of these sort of moments in the film that you see and in the book where you have this description of their home, and you can see these things in their home that are very much things that if you were to go around people's houses in the like 90s, 2000s, and the 80s and things like that, you would see this stuff in their house. Like we had in my house growing up, like several like picture painting things of Jesus and various biblical.
Oh,
like,
I can picture the exact
poses.
one where like the off screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
The praying on the rocks to God. Yes. Yeah, so we had that one. We also had this one where it was like not like a biblical thing, but it was like one that I saw in several of my friends' homes, where it was this like old man who was sitting, and there was like a dark background. He was in just like a very simple house, and it's an old man sitting at a table that was just like very plain, and he's wearing very plain clothes, and he's like sitting there with like a loaf of bread, and he's praying like over his food, and it was just like this very like simplistic, like Quakerish lifestyle dude praying. And we had that over our kitchen table, like in our kitchen. And so I'm like, I can see how like in my household, which was not particularly like fundamentalist, like we weren't like out making our own clothes, but you could have in a more fundamentalist household, like crucifix Jesus on the living room wall. So I could very
and the
much
twist
see
in
that.
Carrie, all of the biblical representations in Carrie's home are about vengeance.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
the flood killing everybody with Noah watching from above. She references Samson, and in her mind, when you hear her in the book, she wants to be like the weapon of God's vengeance. She really connects with those vengeful stories in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And she wishes Jesus would come back so he could smite all these people bullying her. Would he let her help him? Would he, want her to be this one doing the smiting? So I think you see King trying to say like people connect to certain things in religious traditions, but you need to be careful about what you're connecting to, because maybe you're exacerbating what's already within you.
Are we supposed to sympathize with Carrie? Ultimately?
I think so.
Yeah, I would think so.
I think as the bullying victim, who even the fact that she goes to the prom, that after all of the bullying and all of this BS, which he's very clear is also classist because they're poor, and it's part of her being different and religiously different, and her brain works different, she's still willing to put herself out there and make her own pretty dress and try to go to the prom or the spring formal, whatever this is, and still willing to put herself out there. And at no point does she plan this catastrophe, right? It's spur of the moment. They have made her the butt of the joke once again. Everyone's laughing at her. And they killed the one kid who was being kind to her by accident. Mm-hmm. Right? So yeah, I think there's plenty to relate to.
I think that it's perfectly normal to sympathize with people and empathize with people, even if you don't agree with their actions, right? Like,
I like when people put pineapple on pizza, I don't hold it against them. I just think that they're wrong. So that's
like, I sympathize with your need to eat pizza right now.
Right.
And whatever, I just don't agree with it. Right. So yeah, no, I think that it's perfectly reasonable to say like, look, there are circumstances that have led you to this. And like, look, there's a moment right now that has led you to this. And do I agree with the way that you're going about it? No, not necessarily. But like, I can
maybe
see
a little less murder.
Maybe a
less
smidge,
murder.
like, yeah, like less murder. But like, do I understand the need sometimes and the desire to like lash out at something? Yes, obviously. And so like, yeah, totally. And you see that all the time, especially with people who are younger, people whose brains are not fully developed. Right. So it's very easy. I think a lot easier to empathize with Carrie because she's younger. I think if it was like a I don't know, 35-year-old woman who like got mad,
should know better,
at somebody in Target, like, no, I'm not going to empathize with that nearly as much as a teenage girl who has very little autonomy.
And I did think it was really interesting in the book when she starts off on this path of revenge. She doesn't start out to kill everybody. She starts out with the fire extinguishers to make everyone else's looks ruined the way hers is. And then she kind of realizes the electricity thing and she goes off. But then while she's going around like murdering the entire town and deciding she's going to murder her mother, she stops at the Congregationalist church to just go in and pray for a minute and think. Right? It's this very strange moment of her just like, okay, I'm in the middle of this murderous rampage, but what am I really doing? Like, should I check in with God on this here? But I just love that weird bit of psychology. Like she's, yes, on a murderous rampage, but not in the way you would think mentally.
Yeah, you had hit on this a little bit earlier, Rachel, about the idea that maybe there's an autism spectrum to Carrie, that maybe, I'm on the spectrum myself. Both of my boys are. And I'm born in 77 and I grew up in the 80s, and we're not really talking about it as a society. There was the term for Asperger's for a little while, but we really don't start to see these conversations.
And thankfully we've gotten rid of that term. But.
We have, right? But it's like, do you see these allusions? Is King pointing at this at all? Or are we reading too much into it?
I don't think King put it there. I think King wrote her brain looking different because of the telekinesis thing. So she's neurodivergent in that her brain is different because of telekinesis. And in the book, she's also able to like transmit ideas to other people's brains. Mm-hmm. But in our day, knowing what neurodiversity looks like and the autism spectrum, and that there are just lots of different ways that brains work, and some are neurotypical and some are one of these colorful flavors of neurodiversity, I can understand how neurodivergent people look at her and they're like, can relate. Like, oh, my brain worked differently too. I didn't read nonverbal cues. I wasn't sure if I was the butt of the joke. And I couldn't figure out what other people were talking about in those instances. So I can see neurodivergent people relating to her character and her experience. I don't think King sat down to say like, oh yeah, she's autistic. Let's write this way.
I feel like in the moment, when she stopped in the church, right? Like I sort of sat there and was thinking about the number of times that like, when you grow up in church culture, right, they tell you to listen for the voice of God. And they're like, well, it doesn't always sound like a voice. It sounds like something.
Quiet whisper.
Yeah, it's a whisper or something like that. And so like, I kind of was thinking when she walked into the church and was just like sitting there, like you do this sort of thing when you're a kid where you're like, okay, God, I really would like to eat like the second bag of M&Ms that I have here. So like, if you don't want me to eat the second bag of M&Ms I have here, just like say something now. Sort of thing. And so like, I feel like if I was Carrie in that situation, I'd be like, look, God, I have smoked.
I maybe blew up half the town, but if you don't want me to blow up the other half
the town. Yes. Like I, with what I perceive to be your help, have smoked half the town. So if you don't want me to smoke the other half the town, go ahead and just like smite me now. No? Okay, we're good. And then she like leaves, right?
And then like continue smiting.
Yes. And so like in my head, I'm like, that feels very like what I knew at the time to be like very like church culture. And that's how I felt in that scene.
One of the things the movies, both of them, do better than the book is the mother's death. Mm-hmm. Because in the book, all she does is like think of her mother's heart and make it slow down and then make it stop, and her mom just falls. Mm-hmm. In both of the movies, she is like crucified by knives and scissors on the prayer closet door.
Yeah,
right? And it's a very kind of religious, it brings home all that religious iconography that the movie's been playing on the whole time. So I think both movies do a better job of the mom's death scene than the book does.
Yeah, my mom puts tomatoes in her chili, and I've always said because of that I'm going to put her in a home one day, but I've never once thought about crucifying her with the whole bunch of scissors.
With the kitchen knives?
No.
I'm going to say this is a good indication for your psychology.
Okay, that's good. I mean, again, tomatoes don't belong in chili, but beans do for those using in Texas.
I put both tomatoes and beans in my chili. Thank you very much. And serve it with jalapeno cornbread.
That really just makes it taco soup, Rachel.
It does not. It is still chili.
You probably put sour cream on it too, don't you?
I do not.
Okay, good.
Okay, I do.
You got to crumble the jalapeno cornbread into it.
All right. Let me ask you this. This is which way you look at this, this is a benchmark horror film. This is definitely one
Absolutely.
of the, not only of horror films, but of the era as well. What are your three favorite horror films?
I think mine are probably the first horror film that I ever watched as a wee child was Halloween 4. which is bad because that's the one where she like gets out of her bed and he's hiding under her bed and he grabs her ankles and pulls her under the bed, like tries to pull her under the bed.
Oh, you couldn't get out of bed for like a week. Could you?
Rachel, I am almost 31 years old and I still jump out of the bed. I'm not joking. So yeah, that was a little traumatizing. So that's up there. Pet Cemetery. Real solid.
Good one.
Solid one. Yeah.
Another King book.
Another King.
Yeah. And then I would say pretty solidly anything in like the early Scream franchise, would be up there for me.
Scream is definitely on my list. I love the original Scream. Scream 2 was okay. I really liked the twist in Scream 3. And I love the most recent Scream. Scream 4 can go away. But yeah, I have a soft spot for the whole Scream series. Playing with the rules, the idea of the kind of historian explaining the rules, going back and forth, I really love.
Yeah, it's having a lot of fun. Scream's having a lot of fun with itself, right? Like
absolutely.
That first one's a brilliant film, the way it lays things out. Did you ever see Children of the Corn?
I did not.
That was one that stuck with me. But I remember seeing bits of that in like the 80s, like growing up, because I was a adult horror film, and I was a little kid. I wasn't allowed to watch that. And that stuck. What about the Evil Dead series? You guys ever see those?
Mm-mm.
With the Sam Raimi? Oh my gosh. That one. Really
my favorite coming out of Scream, because you've got that comedy part in with the horror. I love the Happy Death Day series, which is basically if you take Groundhog Day and make it a horror movie, but the deaths don't count because when they die, they're going to wake up the next morning. Mm-hmm. So it's funny, but it's a horror movie and someone's trying to kill her and she's got to figure it out. Right. It's amazing. It's my favorite kind of horror comedy movie.
So
ever.
Is she getting killed like every day?
Every day. And if somebody else dies, well, she needs to go kill herself to reset the day or else that person's going to stay dead. So she comes up with increasingly fun ways to kill herself, to restart the day. And figure it out again to figure out who is trying to murder her. But it's so good. And it is the only horror movie where the sequel is just as good as the original.
Okay. I'm going to have to like this up.
You will have so much fun watching that film.
I want to ask you about Stephen King. We think a lot about authors in American history, whether it's Mark Twain or whether Hemingway or any number of folks. What's King's legacy here as far as like as an author? When we remove ourselves from 2023 and we look back on the latter half of the 20th century, early part of the 20th
just decades of work.
Yeah, he's been arguably the most prolific writer in American history. He's got to be up there.
I mean, we could laughingly throw in James Patterson, but King writes his own stuff. So.
Oh, wow. That was it right there.
To be fair, King and Patterson have had their back and forths about that. So
really, okay, well, that's fair. I'm going to go Team King on that all day long, just because I love the Dark Tower series with the gunslinger.
Yeah, that's fun.
That was the only time I've ever actually taken a book and thrown it across a room and not picked it up for a year. Was I got so mad in one of those books about what happened to one of the characters that I literally threw the book across the room and didn't pick it back up for a year. So
wowza.
Yeah.
But it's a good author that can get that kind of emotional reaction out of you, right? You're not necessarily mad at the author. You're mad at the character.
Well, it's funny because I remember all the committee members on my dissertation committee telling me they also threw my dissertation across the room as they were reading it, and not because it was good. So,
mine did that because I had a typo on the cover page that I didn't catch.
I mean, the actual cover page.
The dates in the title of my dissertation were incorrect.
Oy.
They passed me. It's fine. I got the degree.
All right. Last question. Is Carrie a history film?
Yes.
It even has a research angle in it. So she has to research telekinesis, which is like my favorite thing as a historian, to see a character try to research and find the history of something. So, and in both movies, they do like a whole thing, the card catalog in the OG version, the internet version, and the new one. Right. So I love that. But it's also historical in that the original is very much a product of its time, of the gender roles of high school, of all of that going on. And to see the remakes, you have to update that stuff. So I think it says a lot about the era each film is made in as well.
So I think that it also really fits in with the 70s, right? The 70s is really a time period of just like constant violence. Like when you turn on your TV, you're just like it's serial killers. You have John Wayne Gacy.
There's all these jokes about Vietnam in the book. There's
Yes.
segregationists and civil rights protests.
You have, even when it comes to the like religious extremism and the sort of fundamentalism, you have Jonestown and all of that sort of stuff going on in the 1970s. You have the Mansons, you have the Zodiac killer, and you've got all this stuff happening. And so I think that in terms of the sense of the sort of themes that we see, it's very fitting in that time period. And I don't know that because obviously King took forever to write this. He sort of like sat down, wrote it, tossed it, came back to it, sort of thing. And so I don't know how much of that was intentional, but I feel like when you look at the film, like it feels very fitting for that time period. Not necessarily like she's not a traditional serial killer and that she's like going out and like, I don't know, sending messages back to the police department. I mean, I guess exploding it is a message to the police department, but like, she's not.
Yeah, she's a spree killer.
Yeah, she's a spree killer. And so I feel like that very much fits in with what was happening at the time. And so if you're going back and watching this, you're just like, yep, just a Tuesday. Oh, it's another one. And so I think that that's very resonant of sort of the type of violence that you were seeing at the time. And I think that that's sort of in a way that other things aren't. Like, it's not necessarily a timeless film in some ways. Like the kind of bullying that you see is not very timeless. Like kids bully each other in different ways now. And kids, I think, are a lot more empathetic. Like teens are a lot more empathetic in some ways today than they were in the ways that you see it in the book and the film. But I think that when you look at the kind of violence and things like that, that tends to be a little bit more timeless, that this idea is a bit more transcendent than other things.
I also like in the book, the way it's set up is almost like The Handmaid's Tale. Like you're looking at historical documents and like investigations into what happened, and they're looking at timestamps and they're trying to figure out exactly what happened. And as a historian, of course, that's how my brain works. So it works for us. But yeah, it's a really cool kind of throwback. If you liked The Handmaid's Tale, you would like Carrie the book, the way that it is structured and how you're trying to figure out the mystery as it goes along and changing perspectives to different witnesses and different testimony and that sort of thing as well.
It's awesome. Rachel, Nicole, where can people find you guys on Twitter or elsewhere?
I'm Ph.D. Rachel on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the above. So give me a follow on any of those. We'll try. And I just had a video out with Vox, so look for me on their site as well.
Yeah, and I am on Twitter at Nicole Donawho. I'm also on Instagram if you're interested in photos of my dogs. So you can find me there at Nicole Donawho as well.
You guys killed it today.
Party hard.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of Movies Podcast. Thank you so much to our guests, Rachel Gunter and Michelle Donawho. I can't wait to get you guys back on the pod again. Maybe for something that doesn't scare the crap out of me next time. I don't know. Maybe that would be fine. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, who makes this show run. You can find him on Twitter at Fletcher_Powell. And of course, thank you to the listeners, everybody, for tuning in today. For jumping in with us week after week. Could not do this without you. If you want to learn more about HATM, you can find me at Herbert History on Twitter. You can also find the Historians of the Movies Instagram page. And there's a new website for HATM, historiansofthemovies.com, coming soon. So keep your eyes open for that. And keep liking, subscribing. And if you will, drop a comment, drop a review in on the pod. Help us build the algorithms. But between now and then, thank you guys so very, very much for coming in. Love this community, and we will talk to you a little bit later. Ciao for now.